Hey guys, I'm Hannah Rochelle, your instructor, so welcome to Fundamentals of Communication. If you haven't already, take a look at the syllabus please, and just note that I made an announcement about this, there is a small error on the syllabus quiz about the citations requirement, so take a look at that. Don't worry, I will adjust your grade. Okay, so I want to go through chapter 1 quickly, just so that you guys can have some little high points of this chapter, and in case you don't have the book yet, because I know some of you are still waiting on it, so you can still take your quiz by Sunday. So let's go through chapter 1, some of the most important parts, the stuff that will be on the quiz. So the very beginning of this chapter begins by identifying what communication is. It is a complex process through which we express, interpret, and coordinate messages with others. So as we're going to learn in this course, we're going to be going through some of the basics of communication. We're going to hopefully be improved in communication by the time we are done with this class, by the time the winter holidays roll around. So at its core, communication is about messages. So messages can be purposeful, they can be unintentional, they can be verbal, they can be nonverbal, they can be visual, an image, they can be all sorts of things. And the way that we become stronger communicators is understanding how to craft certain messages to make sure that our audience, whoever that audience may be, understands them well. So when we are sending messages, we are encoding them. Think of yourself almost like a computer or a person creating code for a computer. So you are encoding these messages. The words that I'm choosing right now to give this lecture, I'm encoding these. And you, as you're taking these words in, are decoding these words and understanding them. However, what's really cool is that most of the time we are encoding and decoding at the same time, especially in more synchronous communication like face-to-face or a video chat or things like that. We are encoding if we're sending a message, so that could be words, but that could also be our feedback, which would be things like nodding our head or making eye contact or not paying attention or getting out our phones. All of that sends messages. So it's a constant encoding and decoding circle that we're doing as we're communicating. And that, I remember, is because of feedback, which is the verbal and nonverbal messages sent by receivers to let senders know how the message is being interpreted. But again, that feedback can sometimes be unintentional. So knowing what your feedback is and what your body and face are doing is really important. And we're going to talk about how to improve that over the course of this semester. So let's talk through the communication settings, which is kind of the basis for this course. So there are 5 settings. The first one is intrapersonal communication, which is INTRA personal communication. So that is communication that you have with yourself, which is also known as self-talk. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the next couple of chapters, because how you communicate with yourself influences how you communicate with others. That's the first one, intrapersonal. Then we move to interpersonal communication, INTER, personal communication, which is communication between 2 people. So your best friend, your partner, co-worker. Those are all interpersonal communication situations. And that is our first technical unit. Intrapersonal, I sort of roll into interpersonal. So we kind of learn about those at the same time. Then we move to small group communication settings, which is 3 to 20 people. You're going to have a small group project due in here later in the semester. There won't be 20 people in that group. Technically it could be, because that's definition, but it'll probably be somewhere from 4 to 6 people, so it'll be a much more manageable number for y'all. Then we move on to public communication, which is 20 plus people. So that means that you're giving a speech in front of a bunch of people, essentially, which is, again, another project that you guys are going to work towards. And then from there, we also have mass communication, which is everything that happens en masse, which would be something like a public broadcast or even a billboard would be considered mass communication. Spam emails, all that kind of stuff, something that's given on the news, that's mass communication because it's given to the masses, okay? So now that we know about the different contexts and how this course is set up a little bit more, let's move into the actual communication model itself. So if you have your book, or whenever you do get your book, you might want to look at figure 1.2. I believe it's on in Comm 6, it's on page 9. On Comm 5, it's on page 8, which is the book that I have. And it looks like this. Sorry. So it basically has a big oval, and these are within this big oval is the communication context. And within that, then you have your participants in the communication situation, you have the messages being sent, you have the feedback, you have encoding and decoding. But let's talk about those contexts, because there are 5 of them. The communication context is made up of the physical, the social, historical, psychological, and cultural situations that surround a communication event. So the physical context is where you actually are. Are you in a loud restaurant in Starbucks, or where lots of things might be happening that keep you from understanding easily, or are you sitting at somebody's house comfortably? So the physical context really can play into how easily the conversation is had. It can play into power plays sometimes. Let's think about, if you ever have had to go into your boss's office and they have to talk to you about something serious. You're going into their space. So automatically it feels like almost they have the upper hand there. So physical space really does play an important role. So you should think about that, especially with important communication situations. Where should you have this conversation? Then you've got the social context, which is the relationship between the two people. Are you best friends? Are you, my dog, are you best friends? Are you co-workers? Are you boss and employee? Are you student teacher? All those kinds of relationships play into the dynamics of the conversation. The better you know somebody, the easier it's going to be usually to communicate with them. Then you've got the historical context, which is all the communication that has happened prior to that event, that specific event that you're in at the moment. So let's say that, you're sitting down with your best friend and another one of y'all's friends, and you and your best friend had this conversation last week about a certain topic, and y'all bring it up again, but you don't really explain it to the third person. So while you and your best friend are spouting off like, oh yeah, you remember that, blah, 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 the third person is like, wait, what are y'all talking about? Because they don't know. So you can see how that can sometimes impede with other people or leave other people out of the situation, whereas with you and your best friend, you're just building on that conversation and it's happening really fast. So it can be a great thing, but just be aware that if somebody else is a part of that and they don't know about that history, then they need to be brought up to speed. Then you've got the psychological context, which is everything that's happening in your brain that you bring to a communication setting. So are you mad about something? Do you have a headache? Are you frustrated for whatever reason? And if you bring that energy into it, it can a lot of times really affect what happens in that communication situation. It could also be a positive thing. You could also be in a really positive mood and help uplift the conversation as well. Then you have the cultural context, which is all the values and beliefs and all of that stuff that goes into each individual person that they are bringing to whatever situation they're talking in that time. And so just really be aware that that no matter what a person, where a person is coming from, each person, not even each family, each person has their own individual value belief system. So you have to take that into account. It's really important to take that into account, that not everybody is going to come at whatever you're talking at from your angle. And to be a better communicator, you need to realize that and adjust appropriately. All right, so let's talk about a couple of the other things that go into this model. Let's bring it up again. So if you can see, it might be hard, but right down here we have these little lines that are going up and down. So that is physical interference, or external noise is the other word for it. So go back to that being in a loud restaurant, being a loud Starbucks. You've got music going off, you've got people talking around you, you've got the baristas making drinks and yelling names. That might not be the best place to have a really serious, important conversation, because there's a lot happening. There's a lot of external interference, external noise, right? So on top of that, you also have to think about the psychological interference, or the internal noise, like, again, going back to, do you have a headache? Are you not in the mood for this conversation right now? All that kind of stuff plays into how well a communication situation goes down. So really important, make sure you know those terms: encoding, decoding, the contexts, the psychological interference or internal noise, and then the physical interference or external noise. Know what those things are. Now we're going to move to the characteristics of communication. This is really important. So there are a few characteristics that I just want you to kind of build upon throughout the semester. Keep it in your brains because they're really important. Knowing these will make you a better communicator. So the first, communication has purpose. A few of those purposes are, we can communicate to develop and maintain our sense of self. Through conversations, we understand what we like, what we don't like, things that we're good at, things that we're bad at. So it helps us develop our sense of self. We also communicate to meet social needs. So just as we need food and water, we also just sometimes need to sit down and talk with people. It makes us feel better. We communicate to develop and maintain relationships. So communication and disclosure is one of the main tools. We'll talk about that when we discuss more about developing relationships. But it is one of the main tools, if not the main tool, that helps us move from, okay, I want this person to be a close friend of mine, or okay, they can just stay being a casual friend or an acquaintance. We also communicate to exchange information, which is what we're doing here. And then also we communicate to influence others. So you're going to see a lot of this with the elections coming up. Persuasion is going to be at an all-time high, but just think about it even outside of election years. You're going to have things like advertisements, and even just sitting down with your friend, figuring out where you want to go for dinner. Like they might want to go to their favorite Chinese restaurant, and maybe you don't want to go there, so you're just sort of pushing and pulling, seeing who can win and influence the other one to get to go where you want to go. So first characteristic, communication has purpose. Second characteristic, communication is continuous. So I want you to make sure that you understand communication is continuous, which means we cannot not communicate. Write that down, seal that in your brains, because it is so vastly important. We cannot not communicate. Even when you're not sending a message, that's sending a message because it is being interpreted. So if your friend shoots you a text message, you don't shoot them something back immediately. They're going to think, ooh, is she mad at me? Ooh, is she too busy to talk to me right now? Ooh, does she not want to be my friend anymore? You might be going from 0 to 100, interpreting a message that was never meant to be sent, but it doesn't matter because that's what's being interpreted. Okay? So you got to think about that. Even in a conversation saying, I don't want to talk about that right now, even shutting down the conversation is communicating. So remember, our feedback can be intentional or unintentional. We just have to monitor what we're doing, which we will discuss how to be really good self-monitors and appropriate self-monitors for situations in the next couple of chapters. Communication is also irreversible. So think about this. Have you ever said something in the heat of battle with an argument with somebody and you wish you hadn't said it? I mean, we've probably all been there, right? So I got a friend right now, and in fact, who is having issues with her husband, who they got into a big fight, and they both said things that they regret, and they're working through it right now. And they're trying to, get some therapy to see how can we communicate better so that we don't say things like that. Because you can obviously move beyond it and still have a good relationship with that person, but no matter what, that message has been sent, and the only thing you can do from there is try and progress from it, which a lot of times can be really difficult, especially if it's something hurtful. Communication is also situated, so this is a big one. This means don't take things out of context. We see this so often. People just take things out of context, and so when they're out of context or out of that situation in which they were said, a lot of times the meaning is misconstrued or the meaning completely changes. So you have to be a conscious, critical listener and ask yourself, okay, but when and where did she or he say that, right? And who do they say it to, right? Ask yourself those things. Maybe do a little research if something seems weird or fishy or doesn't make sense coming from a certain person's mouth. Usually you'll figure out it was taken out of context. And then the last one I want you guys to focus on is that communication is indexical. So communication is an index or a measure of the emotional temperature of a relationship at any given time. I used to babysit in high school for this family who they are now divorced. And you could tell because the communication within their relationship was really unhealthy. It was such an index of the level of miscommunications and the level of not working together properly that was happening within their relationship. And I could tell even as a teenager through their communication that they were having big issues. But just think about looking across, sitting at a restaurant whenever we can do that again, really, and looking at a couple friends who are super engaged in a conversation, or two people who are sitting there on the other end of the spectrum with their phones, both of them are looking at their phones, not looking at each other at all. What would you think about each of those situations? What would you think about those relationships? The first one, you'd probably think, ooh, they're super close, they love hanging out with each other, they missed each other, being around each other really elevates them. The second, with the phones, you'd probably be like, oh, why are they even hanging out, right? They don't seem like they like each other at all. So communication can be a really good measure or index of what's happening in a relationship. So just to go back over, characteristics I want you to remember: it has purpose, it's continuous, irreversible, communication is situated, and it is indexical. So make sure to think about those. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is communication competence. So this is the impression that communicative behavior is both appropriate and effective in any given situation. So remember those two keywords: appropriate and effective when it comes to communication competence. So communication is effective when you achieve your goal, and it's appropriate when it conforms to what is expected in a situation, right? So there are certain situations, when you're hanging out with your friends, that you can talk a certain way, but at work you may not talk that way. That's called self-monitoring. We'll discuss that more in the next couple of chapters. But that means that you're being a competent communicator when you are thinking about, okay, hey, I shouldn't use this certain type of language in this situation because it's just not quite appropriate for this audience. You have to tailor what you're going to say based on who your audience is, okay? And the more you do that, the more competent you're going to be as a communicator. This doesn't mean that you're, not changing who you are. We all make small adjustments to our communication just to make sure that it gets listened to properly. And that's what competent communicators do, and that's how they get their message across effectively, quickly, and smoothly. The one last thing in this chapter that we're going to talk way more in depth about later when we get to the public speaking unit, but I just want to touch on it now just because I want you to be aware that a lot of times, yes, you can have apprehension about communication, just communication in general. Going into a difficult meeting with your boss might be really anxiety-ridden for you. Maybe you're having to break up with somebody. That's never easy, right? So communication apprehension can happen at all levels of communication. Some people just think it's tied to public speaking, and it's absolutely not. Rude. Stop. Sorry, my dog. But just be aware that communication apprehension can happen at all levels. And as we talk through these next few units, hopefully you'll understand how to accommodate for yourself to make yourself more comfortable in situations that you might otherwise feel uncomfortable. So that is chapter 1. So please make sure, take notes on that. Watch this as many times as you need to, just to make sure that you do well on that chapter 1 quiz. Remember, it is due on Sunday night. And message me with any questions. Again, welcome to the class, and I look forward to working with you guys in the next few weeks. Okay, bye-bye.